The avoidant does not consciously scan for specific communication patterns when meeting new people. They do not maintain a checklist of linguistic traits that make someone attractive or a list of conversational styles that trigger their interest. The attraction happens at a deeper, more primal level. Their nervous system recognizes certain ways of communicating as fundamentally safe, as language that does not activate the threat responses their psychology has been organized around avoiding. When an avoidant encounters someone who communicates in these specific ways, something in them relaxes. The constant vigilance their attachment system maintains, the perpetual monitoring for signs that intimacy is about to demand more than they can give, the exhausting internal calculation of whether this person will eventually require them to be more emotionally available than their nervous system can tolerate, all of it quiets. This recognition happens beneath conscious awareness. The avoidant does not think this person's communication style is safe for my nervous system. They simply feel drawn to this person in ways they cannot fully articulate, find themselves wanting to spend more time with them, discover that conversations do not leave them feeling drained or defensive the way most interactions do. The attraction manifests as unusual comfort, as the sense that they can be themselves without constant self-monitoring, as the rare experience of connection that does not immediately activate the urge to create distance. The communication patterns that draw avoidance are not what conventional relationship wisdom suggests. They are not patterns of extreme patience or endless accommodation, or careful tiptoeing around the avoidance sensitivities. These approaches often repel avoidance rather than attract them, because they signal that the person has identified the avoidant as damaged or difficult, has categorized them as someone requiring special handling, has decided they are a project to be managed rather than a person to be engaged with as equal. The avoidance psychology is exquisitely sensitive to being treated as broken, and any communication style that suggests their patterns have been noticed and are being accommodated triggers exactly the shame and defensive withdrawal the accommodating person hoped to prevent. What actually draws avoidance is communication that is not about them at all. People who communicate in these specific ways are not adapting to the avoidance patterns, but expressing their own authentic communication preferences. They are direct because directness is efficient. They respect response time because they value their own autonomy and extend that same respect to others. They assume competence because they naturally engage with adults as capable peers. They share without requiring reciprocity because they have other outlets and do not need any single person to meet all their emotional needs. They frame requests as preferences because they genuinely are okay with either outcome. They name and validate experience because they value accuracy and acceptance over demanding that reality be different than it is. The communication styles that genuinely attract avoidance share a specific quality. They create space for connection without demanding it, offer presence without pressure, demonstrate interest without generating obligation. These patterns feel safe to the avoidant, not because they enable avoidance, but because they eliminate the specific anxieties that make avoidance necessary. When someone communicates in these ways, the avoidance nervous system can relax its constant defensiveness because the communication itself is not triggering the threat responses that typically make intimacy intolerable. Understanding these patterns requires recognizing that avoidants are not drawn to distance for its own sake. They are drawn to communication that allows them to remain autonomous while being connected, that permits them to engage without feeling consumed, that creates the specific conditions under which their nervous system can tolerate closeness without activating the terror that closeness typically generates. The people who attract avoidance most powerfully are not those who pursue them, despite their walls, but those who communicate in ways that make the walls temporarily unnecessary. Pattern 1. Direct, emotionally neutral language that states facts without embedding demands. The first communication pattern that draws avoidance is the use of clean, straightforward language that conveys information without layering it with emotional subtext, implied expectations, or hidden agendas. When someone says exactly what they mean in the most direct possible terms, when they communicate their needs as simple factual statements, rather than emotional appeals, when they ask questions that are actually questions rather than veiled criticisms or tests, the avoidance nervous system recognizes this as safe communication, language that can be taken at face value without requiring exhausting interpretation of what the person really means beneath what they are saying. Avoidants live in constant low-grade anxiety about misinterpreting what people need from them. Their attachment wounds have trained them to believe that people's stated needs are never the full story, that beneath every request lives a deeper demand, that accepting one level of intimacy commits them to escalating levels they cannot sustain. This anxiety stems from early relational experiences where caregivers' emotional needs were unpredictable, where the avoidant child learned that no amount of attentiveness could reliably predict what would be required of them, where safety meant staying vigilant to hidden expectations that would suddenly materialize and punish them for not having anticipated them. When someone communicates with pure directness, "I would like to spend time with you this weekend," rather than, "I feel like we haven't been connecting lately, and I miss you, and I'm worried that you don't care about spending time with me," the avoidant can respond to the actual request without having to process and manage all the emotional weight that typically accompanies it. The first statement is a simple invitation with clear parameters. The second statement is an invitation wrapped in emotional disclosure, relational anxiety, and implied criticism, all of which the avoidant now has to navigate before they can even get to whether they want to spend time together this weekend. The difference between these communication styles is profound for the avoidant. The direct request allows them to check in with themselves about whether they have capacity and desire for connection this weekend. If yes, they can say yes. If no, they can decline with minimal guilt because the request was not laden with emotional weight. The indirect request requires them to first address the person's feeling of disconnection, manage the person's worry about whether they care, reassure the person that their reluctance to spend time together is not evidence of lack of caring, and then, only after all that emotional labor, get to the actual question of whether they want to spend time together. By the time they have processed all the embedded emotional content, they are too exhausted to want connection, even if they had capacity for it initially. The directness that attracts avoidance is not coldness or lack of feeling. It is emotional efficiency, conveying what needs to be conveyed without unnecessary elaboration, asking for what is wanted without requiring the other person to decode hints or manage feelings or demonstrate care through complex verbal performance. The avoidant is drawn to people who say, "I need space this evening," instead of creating elaborate justifications or apologies for the need, who say, "That comment hurt me," instead of withdrawing into wounded silence that requires the avoidant to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it, who say, "I disagree with your assessment," instead of agreeing to avoid conflict while harboring unexpressed resentment. This pattern works for avoidance because it eliminates the interpretive labor that typically makes communication exhausting for them. The avoidant does not have to wonder what the person really means, does not have to monitor for the emotional subtext beneath the words, does not have to guess whether agreeing to one thing commits them to a cascade of additional expectations. The person has said what they mean. The avoidant can respond to what has been said. The transaction is clean, bounded, completable. This completability is essential. The avoidant feels safe engaging when they can't identify the beginning and end of what is being asked of them. The pattern also prevents mission creep, which the avoidance nervous system is hypervigilant about. When someone makes a request indirectly, embedding it in emotional context and relational anxiety, the avoidant correctly intuits that meeting the surface request will not actually resolve the underlying issue. If they agree to spend the weekend together in response to, "I feel like we haven't been connecting," the person's feeling of disconnection will not be resolved by a single weekend together because the feeling is about a pattern, not about this specific weekend. The avoidant now knows that agreeing to this request commits them to an ongoing project of addressing the person's disconnection feelings, and that project has no defined endpoint. This open-ended emotional labor is exactly what the avoidance nervous system is organized to avoid. Direct communication also prevents the avoidant from feeling manipulated or trapped. When someone states their needs with emotional appeals attached, the avoidant experiences this as manipulation through guilt. They are being required to respond not just to the practical request, but to the emotional distress of the person making it. The avoidance nervous system interprets this as the person trying to control them through emotional leverage, and the response is immediate defensiveness or withdrawal. When someone makes the same request in neutral factual terms, the avoidant can choose to meet the request based on whether they want to, not whether they can tolerate the guilt of refusing. The people who master this communication pattern often do not realize they are doing anything special. They are simply stating their reality without drama, expressing their needs without performance, requesting what they want without elaborate justification. To them, this is just efficient communication. To the avoidant, this is revolutionary. It is the first time they have encountered someone whose words mean exactly what they say, who does not require them to be a mind reader or an emotional manager, who treats communication as information exchange rather than emotional labor. The avoidant finds this person deeply attractive, not because they are detached, but because their clarity eliminates the exhausting ambiguity that typically makes intimacy intolerable. Pattern 2. Communication that respects response time and never demands immediate engagement. The second pattern that draws avoidance is communication that builds in time and space for processing rather than demanding immediate response, that allows the avoidant to engage when they are ready, rather than requiring real-time emotional availability. When someone sends a message and does not follow it with repeated contact if response is not immediate, when they raise a topic and accept that the avoidant might need time to think before discussing it, when they can sit with silence instead of requiring it to be filled with constant verbal exchange, the avoidance nervous system registers this as safe pacing, interaction that can happen at the speed the avoidant can sustain, rather than at the speed intimacy typically demands. Avoidants experience immediate engagement requirements as pressure that activates all their defenses. When someone texts and expects quick response, when they call and seem hurt if the call is not answered, when they raise an emotional topic and need it processed right then without delay, the avoidant feels cornered. Not because they do not care about the person or the topic, but because their nervous system needs time to regulate before they can engage with emotional content. The pressure to respond immediately triggers the avoidance core wound, the feeling that intimacy requires them to be emotionally available in ways that exceed their capacity, that their natural processing speed is inadequate, that who they are is not enough. People who communicate with built-in space understand that response delay is not rejection. They send a message and trust it will be received and responded to when the other person is ready. They bring up something important and accept that the conversation might need to happen later rather than now. They can tolerate periods of low contact without interpreting them as withdrawal or loss of interest. This tolerance is not about having no needs. It is about trusting that needs can be met across time rather than requiring immediate gratification. The avoidant is intensely drawn to this pattern because it eliminates the constant pressure that typically makes them want to flee relationships. They can read a message, process what it is asking of them, formulate a response that feels genuine rather than rushed, and reply when they have the emotional bandwidth to engage thoughtfully. They can hear that their partner wants to discuss something important and know they have permission to say, "I need time to think about this before we talk," without that delay being interpreted as avoidance or lack of care. They can go quiet for a period without someone panicking or demanding explanation or sending escalating messages that create obligation to respond before they are ready. This communication pattern also signals to the avoidant that the person has their own life, their own sources of fulfillment, their own capacity to be okay without constant contact. The avoidant's deepest fear about intimacy is that they will become responsible for someone else's emotional regulation, that the other person will need them to be available in ways they cannot sustain. When someone demonstrates through their communication rhythm that they do not need immediate response, that they can tolerate gaps without falling apart, that they trust the relationship continues to exist even during periods of reduced contact, the avoidant feels safe. This person will not consume them. This person will not require constant maintenance. This person can be close without requiring the avoidant to sacrifice the autonomy that makes closeness tolerable. The pattern also prevents the dynamic that typically makes avoidance shut down entirely. When someone demands immediate engagement and the avoidant cannot provide it, conflict emerges. The other person feels ignored or deprioritized. The avoidant feels pressured and inadequate. The pattern escalates. More demanding contact, more avoidant withdrawal, more anxiety on both sides. When someone communicates with a built-in space, this escalation never begins. The avoidant responds when they can. The person receives the response without resentment about the delay. The relationship maintains connection without constant pressure. The avoidant begins to trust that they can be close to this person without the relationship becoming a source of constant anxiety about whether they are being available enough. Pattern 3. Language that assumes competence and never positions the avoidant as needing to be fixed. The third communication pattern that powerfully attracts avoidance is language that treats them as fully capable adults making their own choices rather than as damaged people whose patterns need to be corrected. When someone engages with the avoidant's decisions without questioning them, respects their autonomy without trying to change how they operate, and responds to their stated needs without suggesting those needs are symptoms of dysfunction, the avoidant experiences profound relief. This person sees them as competent, not broken. This person engages with who they actually are rather than who they could become if they would just heal their attachment wounds. Avoidants are exquisitely sensitive to being pathologized. They can detect within moments whether someone views them as a whole person or as a collection of maladaptive patterns requiring therapeutic intervention. When someone communicates in ways that suggest the avoidant's need for space is a problem to be solved, their emotional reserve is a wall to be broken down, their independence is a defense mechanism to be dismantled, the avoidant immediately categorizes this person as threat. Not because the person is wrong about the avoidant having attachment wounds, they likely do, but because being treated as a project triggers the exact shame that keeps the avoidant defended in the first place. People who attract avoidance most powerfully communicate with the implicit assumption that the avoidance patterns are valid preferences that deserve respect. When the avoidant says they need several days alone to recharge, these people respond with, "Sounds good. I'll do my own thing and we can connect when you are ready," rather than, "I think you use alone time to avoid intimacy, and you would be healthier if you challenge yourself to stay connected." When the avoidant expresses something with minimal emotion, these people engage with the content rather than commenting on the delivery. "Okay, so here is what I think about that situation." Rather than, "I notice you seem very detached when discussing this, and I am worried about your ability to access your feelings." This pattern works because it eliminates the shame spiral that typically prevents avoidance from engaging. When someone treats their patterns as problems, the avoidant either has to defend those patterns or admit they are dysfunctional. Both options are intolerable. Defending feels like arguing that their wounding is actually health, which they know is not true. Admitting dysfunction confirms their worst fear about themselves, that they are fundamentally broken in ways that make them unfit for intimate relationship. The only viable option is withdrawal from the person who keeps highlighting their inadequacy. When someone treats their patterns as neutral characteristics, the paradoxical result is that the avoidant becomes more willing to examine those patterns. They do not have to defend against someone who is not attacking. They can consider whether their need for space is actually serving them or protecting them from something they might want to experience. They can reflect on whether their emotional reserve is genuine preference or learned protection. But this reflection can only happen when it is not being demanded of them, when they are not being pressured to admit pathology, when the person relating to them clearly sees them as whole rather than broken. The communication pattern that assumes competence also prevents the parent-child dynamic that repels avoidance. When someone communicates in ways that suggest they know better than the avoidant what the avoidant needs, the avoidant experiences this as infantilization. The person is positioning themselves as caretaker and the avoidant as someone requiring care. This dynamic triggers the avoidant's profound need to be self-sufficient, to be seen as capable of managing their own life, to never be in the vulnerable position of being the one who needs help. The avoidant will flee this dynamic with remarkable speed, no matter how well-intentioned the caretaking might be. People who understand this communicate with the avoidant as peer. They share their own needs and boundaries without framing them as superior ways of operating. They offer perspective without insisting it is correct. They suggest possibilities without demanding the avoidant take them. They trust that the avoidant is the expert on their own experience, and that their job is not to fix the avoidant, but to clearly communicate their own needs and let the avoidant decide whether they can and want to meet them. This peer-level engagement is deeply attractive to the avoidant because it respects the autonomy that is essential to their sense of self, while still allowing for genuine connection. Pattern 4. Communication that offers information without requiring emotional labor in return. The fourth pattern that draws avoidance is communication that can be received and processed without generating immediate obligation to reciprocate with equivalent emotional sharing. When someone shares something about their day without requiring the avoidant to match the disclosure, when they express a feeling without needing the avoidant to have an equal and opposite feeling about the same thing, when they can be vulnerable without demanding the avoidant be vulnerable in return, the avoidant experiences this as generosity, emotional sharing that is given freely rather than offered as down payment on reciprocity the avoidant must provide. Avoidants often withdraw from communication, not because they are uninterested in what is being shared, but because they sense that receiving the sharing creates debt. The person is telling them something personal, which means they are now expected to tell something equivalently personal. The person is expressing emotion, which means they are now expected to express emotion. The person is being vulnerable, which means they are now expected to be vulnerable. The avoidance nervous system tracks these accumulating debts with anxious precision, and when the debt feels too large, when they have received too much emotional sharing and have not reciprocated equivalently, the avoidant withdraws entirely to avoid the pressure of owing emotional labor they cannot provide. People who attract avoidance communicate in ways that explicitly release the avoidant from reciprocity requirements. They share because sharing feels good to them, not because they need the avoidant to share back. They express their feelings as information about their own internal state, not as invitation for the avoidant to express equivalent feelings. They tell stories about their day because they want to include the avoidant in their experience, not because they need the avoidant to perform equal disclosure about their own day. This unilateral sharing without expectation creates safety for the avoidant. They can receive the communication, can engage with it, can even enjoy it, without feeling the weight of obligation to produce something equivalent in return. This pattern prevents the exhaustion that makes avoidance retreat from relationships. When every conversation feels like an emotional transaction, requiring equivalent exchange, the avoidant is constantly calculating whether they have enough in reserve to match what is being offered. Most of the time, they do not. The avoidant's capacity for emotional expression and vulnerability is significantly more limited than most people's, not because they feel less, but because expressing feeling requires overriding defenses that are extremely costly to dismantle even temporarily. When someone requires equivalent exchange, the avoidant either has to constantly push past their own capacity or withdraw from communication entirely. Neither option is sustainable. When someone communicates with no embedded reciprocity requirement, the avoidant can participate at whatever level they have capacity for. They can listen, can respond to content, can engage with the conversation without feeling pressure to reveal things they are not ready to reveal. Over time, this no-pressure environment is what actually creates the safety for the avoidant to begin sharing more. They are not being required to be vulnerable, which means vulnerability stops feeling like obligation and can start feeling like choice. When the avoidant eventually does share something personal, it is because they genuinely want to, not because they owe emotional labor. The communication pattern also signals to the avoidant that the person has other outlets for emotional processing. When someone shares everything with the avoidant and clearly needs the avoidant to be their primary emotional support, the avoidant feels overwhelmed by the weight of that responsibility. When someone shares selectively and clearly has other relationships and resources for emotional processing, the avoidant feels relief. They are not this person's only support system. The person will not collapse if the avoidant cannot be emotionally available. The relationship can exist without the avoidant having to be everything to this person, and that freedom is what makes them willing to be something. Pattern 5. Requests framed as preferences rather than needs, offering the avoidant genuine choice. The fifth communication pattern that attracts avoidance is the framing of requests as preferences. The avoidant is free to decline, rather than needs the avoidant is obligated to meet. When someone says, "I would enjoy it if we did this thing together, but I am happy to do it alone if you would rather not," instead of, "I need you to do this with me." When they can express desire for something without making the avoidant responsible for their disappointment, if the desire is not met. When they offer genuine choice rather than choice that is theoretically possible, but emotionally coerced, the avoidant feels they can say yes or no based on what they actually want rather than what they are obligated to provide. Avoidants experience most relationship requests as demands disguised as questions. The person asks if the avoidant wants to do something, but the avoidant senses that declining will hurt the person, will trigger conflict, will generate consequences that make declining not worth the cost. The question is not actually a question, but a demand with the surface appearance of optionality. The avoidant learns that the only safe response is yes, which means every interaction involves agreeing to things they do not actually want to do, accumulating resentment, and eventually needing to withdraw completely to reclaim autonomy that has been slowly eroded through false choices. People who understand this pattern communicate requests with genuine detachment from outcome. They want the thing, but they do not need the avoidant to be the one to provide it. They would enjoy the avoidant's company, but they will be fine alone. They are offering an option, not making a demand. This detachment is not performed indifference. It is real internal freedom about whether the avoidant participates or not. The person has enough going on in their own life that the avoidants know is not catastrophic, is not even particularly disappointing. It's just information that helps them decide what to do instead. This pattern is incredibly attractive to avoidants because it means their yes actually means yes. When they choose to participate, they are choosing because they want to, not because they are managing someone else's feelings or avoiding conflict or meeting obligation. The avoidant discovers they can decline things without relationship catastrophe, which paradoxically makes them more willing to say yes. When yes is obligatory, the avoidant wants to say no to everything as protection against the feeling of having their autonomy controlled. When yes is genuinely optional, the avoidant can access what they actually want and often discovers they want connection more than their defenses have been telling them they do. The communication pattern also prevents the scorekeeping that poisons relationships with avoidance. When requests are framed as needs, declining creates debt. The person needed something, The avoidant did not provide it. The avoidant now owes them. The avoidant is acutely aware of accumulating debts and knows they will eventually be expected to pay through increased availability they cannot sustain. When requests are framed as preferences that were genuinely okay to decline, there is no debt. The person wanted something. The avoidant could not provide it. The person handled it themselves, and nothing is owed. This debt-free interaction is sustainable in ways obligation-based interaction never is. People who master this pattern also become safe for avoidants to need things from. When someone demonstrates that they offer genuine choice, the avoidant begins to trust that this person will not trap them through obligation. This trust eventually allows the avoidant to make their own requests, something they typically avoid because requesting creates vulnerability. If they ask for something, they are admitting they need something. And admitting need is exposing the exact dependence their psychology is organized around denying. With someone who has proven they offer genuine choice, the avoidant can risk asking because they trust that declining will not be used against them. That requesting something does not mean they are now obligated to meet every request made of them. Pattern 6. Language that names and validates the avoidant's internal experience without requiring them to change it. The sixth communication pattern that powerfully attracts avoidance is language that accurately reflects what the avoidant is feeling or experiencing and explicitly accepts it as valid without any embedded pressure for that experience to be different. When someone says, "It seems like you need space right now," and then actually gives space rather than using the observation to pressure the avoidant to explain or justify the need. When they say, "I notice you process things internally," and then honor that processing style rather than insisting the avoidant process out loud, when they accurately name what is happening without making it wrong, the avoidant feels profoundly seen and simultaneously safe. This pattern works because it eliminates the gap between the avoidant's internal experience and what they can acknowledge externally. Avoidants typically live in constant dissonance between what they feel and what they can admit to feeling. They need space but cannot say they need space without seeming cold. They feel overwhelmed by intimacy but cannot express that overwhelm without hurting someone's feelings. They want to be alone but saying so sounds like rejection. They are constantly translating their actual experience into something more palatable, something less likely to trigger conflict or hurt, something that protects both them and the other person from the reality of their limitations. When someone accurately names what the avoidant is experiencing, the avoidant does not have to do that translation work. The person already sees what is true and is not requiring the avoidant to pretend otherwise. This elimination of pretense is intensely relieving. The avoidant can stop performing, can stop managing, can just be in their actual state without the exhausting overlay of trying to make that state acceptable to someone else. When someone says, "You seem like you need to be alone right now," the avoidant can say yes, instead of having to construct elaborate justification for why they cannot spend time together tonight. The truth has been spoken by someone else, which means the avoidant does not bear full responsibility for naming their own needs. The validation piece is equally essential. Naming alone is not enough. The avoidant needs to know that what has been named is okay, that their need for space is not being identified as a problem to be solved, but as a valid state that will be respected. When someone says, "You seem overwhelmed, take whatever time you need," the avoidant feels permission to have the experience they are having. When someone says, "You seem overwhelmed, but I really think you should push through this and stay present with me," the avoidant feels exactly the pressure that makes them shut down entirely. The naming without validation is worse than not naming at all, because it makes the avoidance inadequacy explicit. People who attract avoidance with this pattern also demonstrate through their validation that they are not taking the avoidance needs personally. When someone can say, "I can see you need space, and that is totally fine. I will do my own thing," the avoidant hears that their need for distance is not wounding this person, is not creating obligation to compensate later, is just information that helps the person decide what to do with their own time. The need has been depersonalized, which means the avoidant can meet it without guilt. This communication pattern creates profound safety because it proves the person can handle the avoidant's reality. The avoidant's deepest fear is that their truth, that intimacy overwhelms them, that they need extensive alone time, that they cannot be as emotionally available as most people expect, will be too much for someone to accept. When someone not only accepts it but names and validates it, the avoidant discovers they do not have to hide their reality from this person. They can be honest about what they need without relationship catastrophe. Over time, this safety is what allows the avoidant to become more present, not because they are being pressured to change, but because they are being accepted as they are, which paradoxically reduces the threat that makes them defensive in the first place. These 6 communication patterns share a fundamental quality. They create relational safety for the avoidant by eliminating the specific threats that make intimacy typically intolerable. They do not enable avoidance or accommodate dysfunction. They offer connection in forms the avoidance nervous system can actually process without activating defenses. People who naturally communicate in these ways often do not realize they are doing anything special. They are simply being direct, offering space, respecting autonomy, sharing without requiring reciprocity, making genuine requests, and naming reality without judgment. To them, this is just how they communicate with everyone. To the avoidant, this is revolutionary. It is the first time they have encountered someone whose communication style does not require them to be different than they are in order to be close. The profound attraction avoidants feel toward these communication patterns is not about seeking relationships that demand nothing of them. It is about seeking relationships where what is demanded falls within their actual capacity, where they can meet the person's needs without destroying themselves, where connection is possible without constant terror. When an avoidant finds someone who communicates like this, they experience something they rarely experience in intimate relationships: the possibility that they could be themselves and be close to someone at the same time, that they do not have to choose between authenticity and connection, that maybe their way of being is not fundamentally incompatible with intimacy after all. The transformation that occurs when communication matches. Capacity. When avoidants encounter communication that actually works for their nervous system, something remarkable happens over time. The constant vigilance they typically maintain in relationships begins to relax. They stop monitoring every interaction for signs that too much is being asked of them, stop calculating whether they have enough emotional bandwidth for what is being requested, stop preparing for the inevitable moment when their limitations will be exposed as inadequate. This relaxation does not happen quickly. The avoidant has spent their entire life learning that intimacy eventually demands more than they can give. When that moment never comes, when the person continues communicating in ways that respect the avoidant's actual capacity, when months pass and the avoidant realizes they have not once felt cornered or trapped, something in their psychology begins to shift. They start to trust that this person means what they say, that directness is actually directness and not manipulation, that space offered is genuinely space and not a test. The avoidant's fear of intimacy is fundamentally a fear of need. They believe that needing someone makes them vulnerable to abandonment, that dependence will be weaponized against them. When someone communicates in ways that eliminate these threats, the paradoxical result is that the avoidant becomes willing to need them. Not because they have decided need is safe, but because this specific person has demonstrated through consistent communication that they will not exploit the avoidant's need. This transformation manifests subtly. The avoidant begins reaching out more frequently because they genuinely want contact. They start sharing more of their internal experience because they feel safe enough that disclosure does not feel like exposure. They allow themselves to plan for future togetherness without constant escape hatches. They begin building their life around this person, not as obligation, but as genuine desire. Why these patterns are rare and what this means. The communication patterns that attract avoidance are not common. Most people communicate with embedded emotional subtext, expect relatively immediate response, approach others' patterns as problems to solve, share with expectation of reciprocity, and frame requests as needs. These are not malicious patterns. They are simply how most emotionally healthy people interact. For securely attached people, these patterns work. For avoidants, they are incompatible with their nervous system's capacity. This rarity creates predictable outcomes. Avoidants spend most of their relational life feeling like they are failing at intimacy. They encounter person after person whose communication style requires things they cannot provide, and they interpret this consistent failure as confirmation that they are fundamentally broken, that their attachment style makes them unfit for relationship, that they should give up on finding anyone who can be with them as they actually are. Many avoidants eventually withdraw from intimate relationships entirely. After enough experiences of feeling inadequate, of being unable to meet others' communication needs, of watching relationships fail because they cannot provide what seems natural to everyone else, the avoidant decides that solitude is preferable to constant relationship failure. They frame this as preference. They are better alone, they do not need intimate connection, they are happier without complications. And at a surface level, this is true. The avoidant in solitude is not constantly feeling pressured, inadequate, and defensive. But beneath that surface relief lives grief about what they cannot have, resignation about their limitations, and the slow accumulation of loneliness that comes from never being fully known. When avoidants do find people who communicate in these ways, the relationship often represents the first time they have sustained intimacy without constant terror. They finally have evidence that their way of being is not incompatible with connection, that someone exists who can be close to them without requiring them to be someone they are not. This discovery is profound. It challenges the avoidant's entire understanding of themselves as fundamentally unfit for relationship. Yet even in these relationships, the avoidant struggles. Years of defensive patterns do not disappear just because someone communicates safely. The avoidant still has impulses to withdraw, still experiences moments of feeling overwhelmed, still battles their deeply ingrained belief that need equals danger. The difference is that the communication pattern creates enough safety that these struggles do not immediately destroy the relationship. The person's consistent directness, respect for processing time, assumption of competence, non-demanding sharing, genuine optionality, and accurate naming of experience means the avoidant struggles can exist without being magnified by communication that triggers additional defenses. What makes these relationships different is not that the avoidant stops being avoidant. It is that the communication pattern creates enough safety that the avoidant can begin addressing their attachment wounds without the constant additional burden of navigating communication that triggers those wounds. When someone communicates in these ways, the avoidant's energy can go toward healing rather than defending. Over time, with consistent safe communication, the avoidant may access more capacity for intimacy than they believed they possessed. Not because they have been pressured to change, but because they have been given space to change in their own time, at their own pace. The people who attract avoidance through these patterns are not relationship experts who deliberately adapted their style. They are simply people who naturally communicate with directness, respect for autonomy, emotional efficiency, and acceptance of others' limitations. They do not realize they are creating rare relational safety. They are just being themselves, and themselves happens to be exactly what the avoidance nervous system can finally tolerate and eventually trust. This match between communication style and nervous system capacity is not about finding someone who demands nothing. It is about finding someone whose way of relating allows the avoidant to show up authentically while still maintaining connection, to be themselves while being close, to engage without terror. The attraction avoidants feel toward these communication patterns is not weakness or limitation in seeking enabling behavior. It is their nervous system, recognizing what it actually needs to feel safe enough for genuine, sustained intimacy. When avoidants find these patterns, they are not finding someone who enables their dysfunction. They are finding someone whose natural, authentic way of relating happens to match what their wounded psychology requires to begin the slow, difficult process of healing. This match is rare, precious, deeply meaningful, and often life-changing for avoidants who have spent their entire existence believing they were fundamentally incompatible with intimate connection. These communication patterns prove that incompatibility was never truly about the avoidant being broken. It was about most communication styles being fundamentally incompatible with how the avoidant's nervous system processes intimacy, safety, and need.